Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Climate Watch. I'm your host, Fei Fei. We hear the term carbon footprint all the time. We're encouraged to shrink ours by changing how we eat, travel, and shop. And companies boast about cutting theirs, weaving sustainability claims into their branding. But what does a carbon footprint really mean? How is it measured? And how can we tell whether businesses are truly reducing emissions or just using the term as a marketing tool? Here in China, policymakers are working on a nationwide carbon footprint management system. But how will it work? Will it actually help consumers and businesses make more informed and climate-friendly choices? To find out, I spoke with Professor Xu Ming. He's also the Associate Dean of the School of Environment at Tsinghua University. With over 20 years of experience in environmental systems engineering and industrial ecology, he's worked both in the US and China. And now he's collaborating with research institutions and industry leaders on the management of carbon footprints. Hello, Professor Xu Ming. Welcome to join us on Climate Watch.
Hello, good morning.
So you've been leading a lot of researches here in China when it comes to the building of a carbon footprint management system. And I'm just very curious about all the basics surrounding this system. Can you first explain to us what exactly is a carbon footprint management system and how does they normally works?
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great question. So first of all, carbon footprint means the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the whole life cycle of a product. Take the bottle in front of you as an example. To make this bottle, we first need to extract oil from underground and refine the oil and make the oil to plastic and then make the plastics into the shape of the bottle. And after you use the bottle, throw it away, and then we will also have another process of taking the waste back or incinerate, etc. So this is called the whole life cycle of the bottle, from the raw material extraction to all the way to the end of life. And during each process of this life cycle, there might be energy consumption, there might be greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon footprint is to account the whole amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the whole life cycle of a product.
So what is the counting unit or function unit for this system?
Per unit of a product. So for example, it could be one bottle with 100 millimeter capacity of volume, or could be 1 kilogram of something else, right? If that thing is measured in weight, mass.
So in theory, I know you've just talked about in theoretically, it involves a lot of steps. And I can imagine when it comes to in practice, there must be a lot of challenges and obstacles just about the bottle that you just used as an example. It seems like a very simple product, but thinking about the steps in manufacturing and also in dealing with the waste afterwards. So normally, what are the challenges or obstacles that we face when it comes to trying to make an effective count of the footprints?
Let me go back to your first question. Your question was the carbon footprint management system. I only explained what a carbon footprint is. So the management system is essentially to use carbon footprint as a lever to manage the greenhouse gas emissions of the society. So imagine that if we have a carbon footprint number for every product that we use, no matter it's a bottled water or a computer you buy or a furniture you buy, if we have information on every product about its carbon footprint, then we can figure out ways to encourage consumers to choose product that has lower carbon footprint. So here consumers means not only individual consumers like you and me, but also institutional consumers like government, like big companies. They have a lot of purchasing power. So if we can have a mechanism to encourage people to choose products with less carbon footprint, that means we can encourage the whole supply chain to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So imagine one day if all the products that we use have a zero carbon footprint, that means the whole society becomes carbon neutral. So that's the purpose of carbon footprint accounting, is to help people to make informed decisions to buy a low carbon product. So, and then back to the next question, obstacles we face right now, as you can imagine, because of the modern industrial system is so complex. So any simple product that we have today, behind the scene is actually a very complex industrial system, like a piece of paper. Even though a paper looks very simple, but it involves a lot of process, like grow tree and cutting the tree and making tree into pump and then making paper. And during that process, you also need to involve energy use. Energy could be electricity, and electricity can come from coal, can come from natural gas, can come from solar wind. And if we use solar wind to produce electricity, we need materials to produce solar panels, to produce wind turbines, right? So it can be a very complex network, even for a simple product. Then you can imagine how complex it could be for a complex product like computers, right? It's beyond human imagination. The biggest obstacle is to figure out the complex connections among all the industrial processes, and then how those processes are combined, organized to make a product. And then imagine how many products we have,
So as the piece of paper you just mentioned, I just had this question pop into my head, is you only talked about the manufacturing of the paper itself. And when it comes to workers working on the assembly line or the production line of this paper, for example, they also consume energy on their way to work and back to home. Does that also count?
Well, that's a very, very good question. It's in theory, yes, we can account that, but so far that only exists in academic research. In practice, we still are focused on the manufacturing processes, because if you involve workers, etc., those kind of things, it can make things even more complex.
Yeah, I was thinking that makes the calculation more endless.
Yes.
You can basically count every step of...
That's true. But if we use a straightforward approach, like we just trace the production process one by one, that's an endless effort, right? Even though there are a lot of circulations. For example, to produce electricity, we need a machine. To produce machine, we need electricity, right? But in scientific research, we have methods to deal with that. We build models to account for all those processes.
So do you also have to call a stop? Like, we have to stop here, otherwise...
Well, that's a very good scientific question you're asking. There are two approaches. One approach is that we stop somewhere, and that's we predefine threshold. For example, if the mass of the process that I'm tracking is smaller than, for example, 1% of the mass of the product I'm studying, we can ignore that process. That's one thing. Another approach is that if we have a complete picture of all the processes in the industrial system, then theoretically we can calculate all the processes until endless. So because that's essentially is a sequential math. In theory we can take into account all those processes.
So in theory, it's possible to make...
It's possible, yeah. But the precondition is that we need to have a lot of information about at least most of the major industrial processes.
Well, is that also a problem? I mean, considering the current technology and also how interlinked each steps of the manufacturing is, do we still have difficulties into taking into account of all the steps that you mentioned?
Oh yeah, of course. First of all, even today, I think nobody knows all the industrial processes that are existing today. I don't think anybody has a whole picture. Maybe, for experts in iron and steel industry, he or she might know a lot about iron and steel industry, but he or she doesn't know anything about electricity industry. And then people in the electricity industry knows a lot about power sectors, but it doesn't know other sector. So because the industrial system is so complex, nobody is expert of everything. That's why it's very, very difficult.
So the issue is about the barriers among different sectors.
Yes, because knowledge barriers among our sectors, and at the same time, it's just the industrial sectors are just so many, right?
So we need someone who is sort of overlooking the whole picture of the industrial system, and who that can be.
Nobody can be that person or organization or even agency, right? So perhaps government statistical agency has some information about the whole picture, but they are also looking at a very macro level. It doesn't involve specific industrial processes, right? So I don't think there is a single person or single organization can do that. So that's why I think it's a very important to have a collaborative mechanism to unite expertise in many different areas to form a whole picture.
Yeah, so your recent efforts, you're trying to build a LCA. And do you think this is kind of be the solution to the challenges that you just mentioned?
Well, first of all, LCA means life cycle assessment. So it's a methodology that is used to calculate carbon footprint. Or not only carbon footprint, but carbon footprint is based on life cycle assessment, right? But we, at the same time, we indeed are working with a lot of universities, research institutes, and companies to just do what I just said, unite a lot of different expertise to develop a whole picture of industrial system. So this is a carbon footprint alliance that we established early this year, January 7th, actually. It's initiated by Tsinghua University, and we invited research institutes, universities, and key players in major industries to form an alliance. And one of the goals of this alliance is to develop a high-quality life cycle assessment database. That database can be used to calculate carbon footprint of each product.
Can I understand that as the first step to draw a whole picture of the industrial system? And then we can starting to make a count, eventually working on to reduce the carbon footprints.
Yes, but those two things work in parallel, not one by one. So when we developing that whole picture of the industrial system, at the same time, we also start to measure carbon footprint of products. Because when we don't have enough data, we can make estimations, we can make assumptions, and then we can still calculate a carbon footprint number for a product. It's just the number, the result might not be as accurate as we want, right? But we still can do that. I think it's important to have something at least at the beginning, then wait until everything's perfect.
Exactly. In that system, for example, for this bottle of water, you sort of figure out all the processes and steps in manufacturing it and also taking care of the waste of it. And then you sort of make the calculation, decide, for example, this bottle of water generate 1,000 carbon footprints along the way. Does that?
For example, 1,000 CO2 equivalent. That's a unit we use because in the whole process of making this bottled water, there might be CO2 emissions, but there also might be methane emissions, which is also a greenhouse gas. So we take into account all the possible greenhouse gases and convert them all into a same unit, which is carbon dioxide equivalent.
So we are using the CO2 as the unit, then making the count. Yes. After figuring out all the theories, the work that you've been involved in, I'm also curious about China's position in it, because China's been working to build such a system, I think, since 2021. I'm not sure what progresses has China made and how do you evaluate that?
Right. That's a broader goal, right? Which until 2023, until end of 2023, I think a majority of the policy mechanism to achieve carbon peak and carbon neutrality are focusing on emission generators, emitters. For example, if you are a coal-fired power plant, you generate a lot of emissions. Then the existing mainstream policies are targeting that particular power plant. For example, the carbon trading system. There's a national carbon trading system which used to only have cover power sector, but I think now they are expanding to a couple other sectors. But anyways, if you are generating emissions, then if it's a power company, then you are covered by this carbon trading system. But if you are not a power generator, you don't generate emissions, you're not part of that game. That's a mainstream policy right now. If you are generating emissions, I'm targeting you. And if you are not generating emissions, go away. Right? It's nothing to do with you. But because our industrial system is a network, it's a chain, right? For example, if Tsinghua University is an organization, we probably don't directly generate too much of emissions, right? Because we don't have manufacturing, we only have heating, right? But we buy a lot of stuff from our suppliers. We buy furniture, we buy computers, we buy electricity. Because of our consumption, we drive upstream emissions, right? Even though emission coming from electricity production has nothing to do with us. Because we use electricity, then somebody else needs to generate electricity, then emissions generated, right? So in that sense, the consumer probably should also take some responsibility about that emission, right? But in the past, mainstream policies are targeting the producers. So in 2023, I think November 23rd-ish, the NDRC released a policy opinion that called for developing a carbon footprint accounting management system in China. I think that's a symbol of the government policy to include consumers as a part of the game, to take consumers' account. Because carbon footprint, we look at the products. Products is used by consumers, right? Take that bottled water again as an example. When the company that produce the water inside their factory, probably they don't directly generate any emissions because it's all electricity, right? They don't burn gas, they don't burn coal. So as a producer, they have no emissions. If you only target the producer, that bottled water company has nothing to do with it. But today, if we have carbon footprint, we can push the producer of the water to try to reduce their consumption of electricity, and then push the electricity company to reduce their emissions. So in that sense, with the carbon footprint accounting, carbon footprint management system, it's a complement to the existing carbon policy in that everybody in a society will become part of the game, not only producers.
In last week's government work report, Premier Li Qiang also mentioned that the building of the carbon footprint management system is one of the priorities for the government this year. So what do you think is the more urgent task?
Well, the carbon footprint system development has been around for 2 years roughly, since November 23rd in 2023. Well, a year and a half. Yeah. So I think the government has done a lot of great work because in the past, in China, there's nothing related to carbon footprint in public policy, right? Only existing in academic research. So we don't have a lot of good foundation to start with. But in the last year, a little bit more than a year, I think the government has done a lot of work, especially a lot of ministries are involved, like NDRC, like Ministry of Ecology and the Environment, like Industrial and Information. They have done a lot of work. First, they have started to create a system of carbon footprint accounting standards. So because the purpose of carbon footprint accounting is not actually to have an accurate number for a particular product. It's about the relative difference. So if this bottled water is, the carbon footprint of this bottled water is lower than another one, even though the absolute value of the carbon footprint might not be as accurate as we want, but if we know the difference, it's still meaningful because we know this one's better than another one, right? And then if this year you're higher, next year you're lower, so that also means you're getting better, right? So because we want to make comparison, to have a fair comparison, there has to be a standard. For same product, our procedures of calculating the carbon footprint should be the same. So that's why the government started to work on. The first step was to establish a standard system.
Is the standard ready so far?
There are many standards. There should be many standards. For a particular product, you should have a standard. For another one, you should have another standard. I think the system is ready. So the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, they first issued a guideline for developing standards and also issued a national standard for a principle for developing, for carbon footprint accounting. And then different organizations, different like industrial trade associations, industrial societies, and then even some companies and some local government, they start to develop carbon footprint accounting standards for various products. So it's not like the central government is doing everything. Central government have a guideline, have a principle, set up principles, and then all the people who are willing or who are capable of doing that are developing standards.
Would regions become also an issue in building these standards? For example, the standards in Jiangsu could be different from the standards in Qinghai, for example.
In those standards, there are two important components. First is for that particular product, the life cycle should include what processes can be ignored. I think for that aspect, it should be the same, no matter it's in Shandong or Jiangsu, because it's the same product, right? But also in those standards, there are also other components like what kind of data you should use. For what process you should use this kind of data. For that process, you can use other types of data. So data, different types of data means different quality. And I think that can be different from region to region. It's based on each region's capacity to provide high quality data. Some region there have good data system, but in other regions, probably that's not the case. Right?
So that's also another obstacle or challenges I can imagine that we also need to work further on.
Right. So for the whole carbon footprint management system, the government first start to develop standard systems. And then the next thing they are doing is everybody to work together to develop a data system. But that has been relatively slow, the progress, because standard is relatively easy, to my opinion. As long as you know how to make stuff, you can develop standard, right? We have a lot of industrial domain expertise to do that. But data, as we just discussed, involves many different sectors. And it has a lot of technical barriers, right? Not everybody has the knowledge, the ability to do that. So first of all, you need to know what data you need to collect. And the second, collecting the data. And then lastly, you're making the data to be in a form that can be used in professional softwares, can be used by verification agencies. That has a lot of information technology barriers involved there.
So what sort of technology do you think could help to clear this barrier?
Well, in the short term, I think it's mostly not technology, mostly is a mechanism. We should have a mechanism to encourage, to allow, or to make people are willing to share their data into a centralized or decentralized system. And then users can find necessary data, relevant data, when they have a carbon footprint to calculate. In the long term, I think, so to my opinion, if we have an ideal case that every product has a carbon footprint number that is very accurate, in that scenario, essentially we would have a digital twin of our industrial system. In each industrial process, what kind of materials are used, what kind of energy are used, and what kind of emissions are generated are digitalized and in real time. And then those information are fitting into the system that whenever you need to know a carbon footprint of something, you just system will tell you. But that's very long term. To make that happen, I think a lot of IT technologies like data space, blockchain, like privacy computing, those technologies should be very helpful, because one of the barriers for sharing data right now, at least for a lot of companies, are because it has a lot of their trade secrets. you want to calculate my carbon footprint, of course, I know. But if I give you the data you needed to calculate the carbon footprint, somebody else took a look at the data, they know how much it costs for me to produce my product. That's my trade secret, right? So that's why a lot of most of the companies, all of companies are not willing to share their data for carbon footprint purposes. But if we have an information system, like including the using the technology like what I just mentioned, private computing, etc., then we can use technology to make sure the data is not used by others. Or even, for us, we just need to know a number, final number. We don't need to know how much this you need to produce that thing in a particular process. So with information technology, we can essentially like you send an equation to the company and then they make a calculation and send a result to us. We only need a result. But the whole process is managed by an information system, a computer system that makes sure data are correct, accurate, and not being tampered.
Can also be protected.
Yeah, protect as also, most importantly, be protected.
So that's also a very futuristic scene that you just described. I can imagine like having a supercomputer doing all the jobs. But then for a lot of businesses, especially here in China, once we have this carbon footprint management system ready, what do you think will be the impact for them, especially the smaller ones, I guess, because big corporations, they have the power and capacity to do the calculation or pay the price if it comes with a price. Would that also affect smaller businesses, increase their costs?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I think yes, at least right now, if there is a mandate, for example, for all the companies to disclose their carbon footprint, then that's obviously a big burden for small-sized companies because they don't have necessary information system ready. I think that's why we should have, in the long term, should have a system that's based on information technology. If the smaller and the medium-sized companies also have that kind of capacity, then calculating carbon footprint will be very easy as big companies do.
In building this carbon footprint management system, I think the earliest effort in the world is quite early. All the information technology, very advanced, like artificial intelligence, like blockchain that you just mentioned, we can sort of speed up the efforts worldwide.
Well, yes, I think the technology is there, like blockchain, like private computing, that's already exists. It's an established technology. I think what we need is to have initiatives to put them together, to have a demonstration to make people be able to see it can be done this way. But I think the biggest challenge is not from China, it's from global community. Because carbon footprint accounting, even though it started pretty late in China, but it has been around for many, well, at least 2 decades in Europe and in the US. Their model is very human-centric or relying on human expertise. There will be consultants that go to your company, they do a survey, and then they come back to make a calculation, etc. We're heavily relying on human knowledge. It has a lot of issues, of course, but because they have been doing this for a very long time, they have a tendency of keep doing that. They don't like change, right? That's human nature, right? So those kind of futurist solution we just discussed seems to be not welcome by the European practitioners and American practitioners. But because carbon footprint is a global topic, there's a global system, people are all follow the same kind of principles. And that global platform is dominated by European and Americans. So I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, you can imagine if we have information technology ready, imagine the jobs that could be affected along the way, and that could be a big political problem in European and also America. But I think as you mentioned, building the carbon footprint management system, one of the reasons for that is to have consumers, not only big businesses, but also individual consumers, to have an idea about what they are purchasing and how many carbon emissions that our consumption generates or helped generate. And then I think, especially in European countries in recent years, there are a lot of debates about this, is that some products will label them as they generate zero carbon footprint. And that can be problematic. And also, I think similar things are happening in China in recent years as well, that some consumers are losing faith in this labeling. Like when they are labeled, they are zero carbon. Do you think this problem can be solved as we have a more holistic and also advanced system as you just proposed?
Oh yeah, of course. If we have an advanced system, we will know, make sure the number putting on the label is accurate, right? But the zero carbon footprint label, I think that's misleading, very misleading.
Well, theoretically, can we really have a zero carbon footprint
Well,
product?
it's up to debate. So, well, in future maybe, but at least right now, I don't think any product can claim them as zero emission unless they spend money to buy carbon sink. So, for example, in theory, every company need to use electricity, and there's no electricity are 100% green. Even for Nordic countries in Europe, there's still a little bit carbon there from coal, from natural gas, etc. So you cannot make a product that is entirely zero emission. So then some company, they spend money to buy carbon credit. Somebody else plant a tree, calculate a tree can absorb how much carbon, and I pay you, I got that carbon and offset my emissions.
And that also is controversial right now.
Yes, it's very controversial, especially in Europe. So I think last year, I might be wrong, in last year or in 2023, European Union has a law, regulation, that it's a consumer protection regulation that make a zero emission or carbon neutral labeling illegal. Because, like was said, they don't think anything can be carbon neutral right now. So if you label it carbon neutral, you're misleading. So from a consumer protection point of view, you are cheating the consumers. In that aspect, we should learn from Europe. I think that's a very good sign. But I think right now in China, any other part of the world, there are still a lot of stuff are labeled as carbon neutral, which is impossible.
Simply because, for example, the power they use can't be 100%.
Yeah. And then if you look in the small fine prints, they define zero carbon in their way. So I think it's just a matter of time that we will also have some kind of policy to regulate how people claim their carbon neutrality or whatever they do.
And I also noticed that you've been meeting with international scholars and also regulators in their carbon footprint management. Recently, you've talked with European peers and also, I think, British peers also at the same time. What are their attitudes when it comes to collaborating with China in building an internationally recognized system?
Well, so the people that we are interacting with are either government think tank, people working in a think tank, like a joint research center in European Union. They are researchers, essentially. Or we are interacting with government officials, but they're in charge of technical issues. We're not interacting with the politicians. So with the think tank people and the technical officials, they are very open, to my understanding, they are pretty open to working with international entities to make the carbon footprint system more robust, more accurate, and useful. I think that's a very good sign, and we are indeed have already started work with them on some aspect of the issues.
As you mentioned, that European countries started building this system for 20 years now. And is there something that we can learn as we are trying to build our own?
Yes, of course. I think what we can learn from them, first of all, we should have a very good data foundation. data system is the foundation of everything else. Second, we should have a mechanism to make carbon footprint useful. Like, for example, in Europe, they have some regulations, either from government regulations or from bottom up, some big companies, their own initiatives. They ask for carbon footprint information when they making their purchases. Then in that case, the producers will have a motivation to, first of all, calculate their carbon footprint, second, reduce their carbon footprint. And then there will be demand for people to help them to do that, like consultancy, etc. So this become a circle. I think what we are lacking right now, first of all, a data system is not as good as we want. Second, we don't have that circular business model. And the government are encouraging us to develop carbon footprint accounting method, a database, and for companies to disclose their carbon footprint. But that's still a voluntary efforts, right? There's no actual demand. If I disclose my carbon footprint right now for a lot of Chinese companies, I can only say that in my ESG reports.
Good reputation.
Use yes, as a PR approach. But it cannot directly bring me any benefit. But it's changing as well. Some big companies, I think right now, are starting to include carbon footprint as one items in their purchasing requirements, criteria for decide who I want to buy stuff from. I think one of the big companies, Fortune 500 companies in China, a Chinese company, state-owned company, they have carbon footprint as one of the criteria. Of course, it's optional, still optional, I think. But if you have a carbon footprint, you get 2 more points.
So it's favorable.
It's favorable, of course. But the weight, the importance are still relatively small. But I think it's a good sign.
Probably starting from this year, as the system more ready and probably more companies will join in and motivated in a way to be part of the efforts to making that calculation, also getting that published. Thank you, Professor Xu Ming.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you to Professor Xu Ming with Tsinghua University for sharing his insights. And thank you for tuning in to Climate Watch. If you have any questions about climate change or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform or explore our newsletter Rivers and Mountains on Substack for the latest updates on China's climate policies. Until next time, stay curious.